They say blood protects blood. Anna's brothers learned exactly what an Omega sister was worth in gold. Anna woke to the sound of leather boots pacing the hallway. Her door stood half open, cold air seeping through the gap and carrying voices she recognized too well. She pushed herself upright, her thin sleeping shift twisting around her legs. Her pulse hadn't even quickened yet. She didn't know to be afraid. Kieran stood near the window, his broad shoulders blocking the moonlight. He was rolling something between his fingers, a coin, maybe, or a token. He wouldn't look at her. He'd been avoiding her eyes for days. What's happening? Her voice came out softer than she meant it to. Preparations. He pocketed whatever he'd been holding. Anna's chest constricted. Preparations for what? Declan filled the doorway, arms crossed over his scarred forearms. His face was carved from stone. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. She looked between them, her brothers, the two people who'd raised her after their parents died. The two people who'd told her she was safe as long as she stayed small, stayed quiet, stayed theirs. Tell me. Her hands fisted in the blanket. Kieran exhaled through his nose. The Bloodstone Pack. They've agreed to take you. Take you. The words were smooth, practiced. As if she were cargo being relocated. As if this had been discussed in detail, terms negotiated, conditions met. Anna knew about the Bloodstone Pack. Everyone in the border territories knew. They were the rival pack her brothers had spent years trying to avoid, the ones whispered about in tones that made even betas go quiet. The pack that didn't negotiate, they dominated. Why? The word barely made it past her throat. Declan's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble. Debt. Territory rights. Protection agreements. He said it like he was reciting a list he'd memorized. You fulfill the terms, everyone stays alive. Fulfill the terms. They made it sound like a job. Like she'd be working in their kitchens or tending their gardens. But Anna had heard the stories about what happened to Omegas in Bloodstone territory. She'd heard what they were used for. They didn't work. They were claimed. Broken. Bred. I'm your sister. Her voice cracked on the last word. Kieran finally looked at her. For just a second, something flickered in his expression, regret, maybe, or shame. Then it hardened over like ice forming on a winter lake. Your payment, he said. The words didn't land like stones. They landed like iron cuffs, snapping shut around her wrists before she even saw them coming. Anna stared at him, at both of them, and understood with perfect, nauseating clarity that this wasn't a sudden decision. This wasn't desperation. This was a transaction they'd agreed to weeks ago. Declan moved first, pulling something from his belt, actual cuffs, black iron, already open. Don't fight this. It's done. Anna's body went cold. Not from fear. From the sheer, brutal efficiency of betrayal. She didn't scream. Didn't beg. She'd been taught her whole life that Omegas who made noise didn't survive long in the border packs. So she sat there, silent, as Kieran grabbed her wrists and Declan locked the iron closed. Where she's going, they'll treat her well enough if she's cooperative, Kieran said, but he wasn't talking to her. He was talking to Declan. Reassuring himself. Anna barely heard him. Her mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere quiet and distant, where a man with silver eyes stood in the snow and watched her like he knew her name. She'd been dreaming about him for months. A king made of shadow and starlight, silent and waiting. She used to think he was her mind's way of escaping. A fantasy to survive the cold reality of being unwanted. She didn't know he was real. She didn't know he'd been searching for her. Somewhere far to the north, in the stone halls of the High Pack Fortress, Alpha King Drogo woke from another dream with a name on his lips, a name he didn't recognize, belonging to a girl he'd never met. But this time, the dream didn't fade. This time, he felt her fear like a blade pressed to his ribs. And for the first time in months, the dream ended with a single, undeniable certainty. She was moving toward him. Welcome to Floxy's Shifter Romance Tales. Please subscribe to my channel and tell me where you are watching from in the comment section. I appreciate you. Anna had been 19 for 3 weeks when her brothers sold her. She'd spent most of those 19 years believing she was fragile, forgettable, and faintly broken. Her wolf had never emerged. Her scent was muted, barely there. In a world where strength was currency and power was survival, Anna had been taught she had neither. What she didn't know, what her brothers had made sure she'd never know, was that her weakness wasn't natural. It was engineered. The journey to Bloodstone territory took 2 days. Anna spent most of it in the back of a reinforced transport, wrists still cuffed, watching the landscape shift from the gentle hills of her border pack to something harsher. The trees grew twisted here, their branches reaching like claws against a sky that never seemed to brighten past gray. No one spoke to her. The guards, 2 Bloodstone enforcers with faces like granite, treated her the way you'd treat livestock being delivered. Functional. Necessary. Temporary. When the fortress finally came into view on the second evening, Anna's breath caught despite herself. It wasn't a home. It was a declaration of war frozen in stone. The walls rose black and brutal against the darkening sky, hewn from some rock that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Towers jutted upward like broken teeth. Banners snapped in the wind, crimson and black, marked with a symbol Anna recognized from whispered warnings, a wolf skull crowned in thorns. Blood dominance. That's what the Bloodstone Pack called their philosophy. Strength through cruelty. Power through fear. The transport lurched to a stop in the central courtyard. One of the guards yanked the door open, and cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of iron and smoke. Out. Anna's legs had gone numb from sitting. She stumbled on the first step down, and the guard caught her arm, not gently, just efficiently, the way you'd steady a wobbling chair. He released her the moment she found her footing. The courtyard was massive, paved in dark stone that looked perpetually wet. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. Pack members watched from doorways and windows, their eyes tracking her with the cold interest of predators assessing prey. A woman approached, tall, severe, dressed in black leather that looked like it had been tailored to intimidate. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it made Anna's scalp ache in sympathy. She carried a ledger. Asset received, she said, not to Anna, but to the guards. She made a notation without looking up. Inventory it and take it to holding. It. Not her. Not Anna. It. The word stripped away the last pretense of humanity. Anna felt something inside her go still and small, the way a rabbit freezes when the hawk's shadow passes overhead. Name? The woman asked, pen poised. One of the guards grunted. Wasn't given one. Just the registration code. The woman's mouth thinned. She wrote something Anna couldn't see, then snapped the ledger shut. Fine. Holding cell 3. Don't let it wander. Beta Cormac wants to inspect it before the gathering tonight. Inspect. Anna rose on unsteady legs. She hadn't eaten since the journey began. Exhaustion pulled at her bones like weights. They didn't cuff her this time. Just surrounded her, one guard in front, one behind, the woman to her left, and marched her back through the corridors. But they weren't heading to the same entrance she'd come through. They were going deeper. The air grew colder. The torches fewer. Anna's breath misted in front of her face. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that made her steps falter. It was clearly used for gatherings, tiered stone seating rows in a semicircle around a central floor. Torches burned in a ring, casting dancing shadows across walls marked with territorial symbols and old bloodstains that had never quite washed away. An arena. This was where they made examples. Pack members were already filing in, taking seats with the casual anticipation of people settling in for entertainment. Anna's scent must have spiked with fear because several heads turned, nostrils flaring, eyes lighting with predatory interest. Stand there, the woman said, pointing to the center of the circle. Don't move. Don't speak. Beta Cormac will address you shortly. They left her there. Anna stood in the center of the ring, surrounded by rising tiers of hostile faces, and felt herself start to fracture. Her vision tunneled. Her breathing went shallow. This is where I disappear, she thought distantly. This is where whatever I was stops existing. She closed her eyes and reached for the dream. Snow. Silver eyes. A presence that felt like shelter. Please, she thought, even though she knew he wasn't real. Please, if you're anywhere, be here. The temperature in the chamber dropped. At first, Anna thought it was just her body shutting down, shock making her feel cold. But then she heard the whispers rippling through the crowd. Heard the sudden shuffle of people standing, movements sharp with surprise. She opened her eyes. The main entrance to the arena had filled with figures dressed in the deep gray and silver of the high pack. But Anna only saw one of them. He stood at the front, and even from across the chamber, his presence was a physical force that seemed to bend the space around him. Tall, taller than her brothers, taller than any wolf she'd ever seen. Broad-shouldered beneath a cloak that looked like storm clouds given form. And his eyes. Silver. Exactly like the dreams. Anna's heart stopped, then slammed back into rhythm so hard it hurt. No. No, he's not real. This is shock. This is my mind breaking. But then he moved, descending the stairs toward the arena floor with fluid, predatory grace, and the entire chamber seemed to hold its breath. Beta Cormac appeared from a side entrance, clearly thrown by the interruption. He recovered quickly, schooling his features into diplomatic neutrality. Alpha King Drogo. He inclined his head. We weren't expecting. Drogo didn't acknowledge him. He'd stopped at the edge of the torch ring, and he was staring at Anna with an expression she couldn't decipher. His nostrils flared slightly. His jaw clenched. Then his eyes closed, just for a second, like a man who'd been searching for something in the dark and finally found light. When they opened again, they were blazing. Whose scent is that? His voice was low, controlled, but Anna heard the threat coiled beneath every word. Cormac hesitated. I'm sorry, Alpha King, I don't. The Omega. Drogo's gaze hadn't left Anna. In the center. Who does she belong to? Anna couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. The entire chamber had gone silent, everyone watching this interaction with the tense fascination of people witnessing a lit fuse approaching powder. Cormac's expression shifted, confusion giving way to calculation. She's asset inventory, my lord. Acquired through standard territorial agreements. She'll be processed according to. Who? Sold. Her. Each word dropped like stones. The beta's throat worked. I would need to consult the records. Drogo finally looked away from Anna, and the weight of his attention landing on Cormac was almost visible. The beta took an involuntary step back. Records. Now. Someone scrambled to comply, rushing from the chamber. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Anna stood frozen in the center of the ring, her mind unable to process what was happening. The man from her dreams was real. He was here. He was angry. And he was looking at her like she was something sacred that had been stolen. When his eyes found hers again, something passed between them, a recognition so profound it bypassed thought entirely and went straight to instinct. I know you, his expression said. I've been searching for you. Anna's knees nearly gave out. Fear spiked through her, but it was tangled with something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The runner returned, breathless, carrying a ledger. Cormac took it with hands that weren't quite steady and flipped through pages. The transaction was, it appears to have been arranged by representatives of the Thornridge Border Pack. 2 individuals, Kieran and Declan. Her brothers, Drogo said softly. Not a question. Cormac's silence was confirmation enough. The Alpha King's expression went utterly cold. When he spoke again, his voice carried through the chamber with absolute authority. Under the law of fated recognition, as witnessed by these assembled packs, he took 3 steps forward, closing the distance between himself and Anna, and she felt the full force of his power wash over her like a wave. I declare formal claim over this Omega. She is under my protection. She is bound to none but me. And anyone who disputes this answers to me directly. The words landed like thunder. Cormac went pale. Alpha King, with respect, the ancient laws haven't been invoked in. Do you dispute my claim, Beta? The threat in those words could have cut stone. No, my lord. Cormac's voice had gone hoarse. Drogo nodded once, then finally, looked at Anna with something other than controlled fury. His expression softened, just barely. Just enough for her to see past the king to the man who'd stood in her dreams and waited. You're safe now, he said quietly. No one here will touch you. Anna opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her entire world had just tilted sideways, and she didn't know which way was up anymore. Drogo turned to his delegation. Prepare quarters for her in the East Wing. Medical evaluation. Food and clean clothes. Then his gaze swung back to Cormac, and the temperature dropped again. And I want the names of everyone involved in this transaction. Every single name. Yes, Alpha King. Drogo moved back toward Anna, and this time he didn't stop until he was close enough that she could see the faint scars marking his jaw, the silver threading through his black hair, the exhaustion hidden beneath his controlled exterior. What's your name? He asked. Anna. It came out as a whisper. Something in his expression cracked, just for an instant, just enough for her to see devastation underneath. Anna, he repeated, like he was testing the shape of it. Like he'd been waiting his whole life to say it aloud. Then he did something that shattered every expectation Anna had built in the last 2 days. He knelt. Right there, in front of the entire chamber, the Alpha King of the High Packs went to one knee and looked up at her with those impossible silver eyes. I've been searching for you, he said. And I swear on my name and my blood, no one will ever make you feel like property again. Anna stared down at him, at this man who'd haunted her dreams, who'd just rewritten her entire reality with 6 words of ancient law. And for the first time since her brothers had locked iron cuffs around her wrists, she let herself believe she might survive this. The political fallout began before Anna even left the arena. Beta Cormac's face had gone from pale to flushed with barely contained fury, his words sharp and diplomatic in that way that meant he was choosing them very carefully, reminding the Alpha King that territorial agreements had been signed, that the Bloodstone Pack had acted in good faith, that destabilizing established trade networks over a single Omega would have consequences that rippled far beyond this fortress, but Drogo had simply looked at him with those silver eyes gone cold as winter steel and said in a voice that carried absolute finality that the claim of fated recognition superseded all contracts, all agreements, all political convenience, that the law was older than any pact currently standing, carved into the foundations of their society when the first alphas learned to shift, and that anyone who wished to challenge it could do so formally in front of the High Council where their objections would be recorded, considered, and ultimately dismissed because the law was irreversible, not up for negotiation, not subject to interpretation, and Anna had stood there in the center of that torchlit ring watching this ancient power reshape her reality, watching pack members shift uncomfortably in their seats because everyone knew the old laws, the ones written in blood and instinct, the ones that even the most ruthless packs wouldn't dare violate publicly, and she'd realized with a clarity that cut through her exhaustion that she was no longer property, no longer an asset to be inventoried and inspected, no longer a transaction her brothers could finalize with signatures and gold. She was claimed, protected, bound to the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, and the iron weight that had been crushing her chest since the moment Kieran said your payment finally, impossibly, began to lift. The journey to Drogo's fortress took 3 days, but it felt like traveling between worlds, where the transport to Bloodstone had been cramped and cold with guards who treated her like cargo. The high-pack convoy moved with organized efficiency and something that looked disturbingly like respect, Anna given her own quarters in a reinforced carriage with windows she could actually see through, soft blankets that smelled of cedar and snow, food brought to her at regular intervals by an Omega woman named Sarah who met her eyes when she spoke and asked if Anna needed anything else, not demanded, asked, and the whiplash of going from object to person in the span of 3 days left Anna dizzy and uncertain, unable to trust that this wasn't some elaborate cruelty that would be snatched away the moment she let herself believe in it. Drogo rode alongside the carriage for most of the journey, close enough that Anna could see him through the window, straight-backed on a massive dark horse, scanning the horizon with the constant vigilance of someone who'd spent too many years defending territory to ever fully relax, and twice he'd stopped the convoy to speak with her directly, not giving orders but asking questions, asking if she was comfortable, if she needed to rest, if the pace was too demanding, speaking to her not over her or around her but directly to her as if her answers actually mattered. And when Anna had asked tentatively on the second day what the claim of fated recognition actually meant beyond protection, Drogo had dismounted and sat across from her in the carriage, close enough that she could see the faint scars marking his hands, and explained in that low careful voice that the law gave her rights, the right to refuse the bond if she chose, the right to her own space and autonomy, the right to leave if she ever felt trapped, that being claimed didn't mean being owned, that fate might have drawn them together but choice was what made a bond real, and Anna had stared at this man who'd rewritten her entire existence with 6 words of ancient law and realized he was trying very hard not to frighten her, trying to give her power in a situation where she'd had none, and something in her chest that had been frozen solid since her brothers locked those cuffs around her wrists began, slowly, to thaw. The high pack fortress was nothing like Bloodstone, where that place had been all brutal angles and dark stone designed to intimidate. Drogo's seat of power rose from the mountainside like it had grown there naturally, gray stone veined with silver that caught the light, towers that reached toward the sky rather than looming over the earth, banners in storm gray and white that snapped clean in the mountain wind. And when Anna stepped from the carriage into the massive courtyard, she saw pack members moving with purpose rather than fear, Omegas walking with their heads up, children playing near a fountain without the nervous glances that came from living under constant threat, and she realized this was what a pack looked like when it was built on strength rather than cruelty, on loyalty earned rather than extracted through violence. Drogo had introduced her to his healer immediately, a woman named Thala with silver-streaked hair and hands that moved with precise gentleness, explaining that after what Anna had been through a medical evaluation was necessary, not optional, but that Anna could refuse any examination she wasn't comfortable with, could ask questions, could have Sarah stay with her if she wanted another woman present, and Anna had nodded numbly and followed Thala to a room that smelled of herbs and clean linen. Letting herself be guided to a cushioned chair while Thala asked questions about her health history, her shifts, her wolf, and when Anna had whispered that she'd never shifted, that her wolf had never emerged, that she'd always been told she was broken or incomplete, Thala had gone very still and asked permission to take a blood sample, just a small one. Something about Anna's scent wasn't adding up, and Anna had extended her arm and watched the healer draw dark red blood into a glass vial. Watched her add drops of various tinctures, watched her face shift from clinical focus to shock to something that looked like rage. The suppressive herbs had been in her system for years. Thala had explained it in technical terms at first, talking about compounds that bound to wolf essence, that created artificial dormancy, that essentially chained the animal side so deeply it couldn't surface no matter how hard the human side reached, and then she'd stopped using medical language and said bluntly that someone had been poisoning Anna since adolescence, carefully and consistently dosing her with a mixture designed specifically to prevent shifting, to mute her scent, to make her appear weak and unremarkable when the truth was that her blood work showed markers of significant power, old bloodlines, the kind of genetic signatures that didn't appear in common border packs, and Anna had sat there trying to process the words, trying to reconcile poisoning with her brother's careful routine of evening tea, the bitter drink they'd insisted she take for her health, for her protection, the drink she'd never questioned because why would she? Why would the people who raised her systematically suppress the core of what she was unless they had a reason, unless they were afraid, unless they knew something about her potential that they decided was too dangerous to let emerge? The anger came slowly at first, a spark in her chest that Anna almost didn't recognize because she'd spent so many years turning every hurt inward, every cruelty into proof of her own inadequacy, but as Thala kept talking, kept explaining how much damage had been done, how many years of growth and strength had been stolen. The spark caught and spread, burning away the shame and self-doubt that had been smothering her since childhood, and Anna felt something wild and fierce unfurl inside her. Ribcage, rage, pure and clean and entirely justified, rage at her brothers for deciding her fate before she was old enough to have a voice in it, rage at every carefully constructed lie about her fragility, rage at being sold like defective merchandise when the only defect was the poison they'd been feeding her. And she looked up at Thala with tears streaming down her face and said in a voice that shook with fury rather than fear that she wanted it out, wanted every trace of those herbs purged from her system, wanted to know what her wolf actually felt like, wanted to reclaim everything that had been taken, and Thala had smiled, fierce and approving, and said they'd start the purging process immediately, that it would take weeks maybe months for Anna's system to fully clear, that the first shifts might be difficult or painful as her wolf finally broke through years of artificial suppression, but that Anna was strong enough to handle it, had been strong enough all along, and the weakness everyone saw was actually endurance, the ability to survive years of systematic poisoning and still be standing, still be whole enough to heal. Drogo had come to her quarters that evening after Thala had started the first round of purging treatments, herbs that would bind to the suppressants and help flush them from her body, and Anna had been sitting by the window watching the sun set over mountains she'd never seen before, wrapped in blankets because the treatments made her cold, made her feel like her body was fighting itself, and he'd knocked softly and waited for her permission before entering, moving carefully like someone approaching a wounded animal, and he'd asked if she wanted company or solitude, and Anna had surprised herself by saying company, by wanting his presence in a way that felt instinctive rather than logical. They'd sat in silence for a long time, the Alpha King and the poisoned Omega, watching the sky shift from gold to purple to deep blue scattered with stars, and finally Drogo had spoken, his voice quiet and almost hesitant, admitting that he'd been dreaming of her for months, vivid dreams that felt more real than waking, dreams where she stood in snow and watched him with recognition in her eyes, where he tried to reach her but the distance never closed, where he'd wake with her name on his lips. Even though he'd never heard it before, and he'd thought he was going mad or cursed, thought perhaps he was being shown something he could never have as punishment for past failures, but the dreams had grown more urgent in recent weeks, more detailed, and he'd started traveling more, visiting packs he'd never bothered with before, searching without knowing what he was searching for until he'd caught her scent in that arena and the world had finally made sense. Anna had turned to look at him then, this man who commanded armies and ruled territories, and confessed that she'd been dreaming too, that she'd seen him standing in endless white, silent and watching, that she'd thought he was just her imagination creating comfort where none existed, a fantasy to survive the cold reality of her life, but the dreams had felt different from normal dreams, more solid, more present, like they were meeting somewhere between waking and sleep, and she'd never told anyone because who would believe that an unremarkable Omega had been sharing dreams with someone who felt like power incarnate, but now sitting here looking at his silver eyes reflecting starlight she knew it had been real, all of it, that whatever connected them had been reaching across distance and circumstance trying to pull them together long before her brothers made their terrible choice. The bond between them hummed with recognition, with the certainty of something that had been building for months in the space between sleep and waking, and Drogo had reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and taken her hand in his palm warm and rough with old scars, his grip gentle despite the strength she could feel coiled beneath his skin, and said that the fated recognition wasn't just ancient law, it was the name their ancestors gave to bonds that existed before first meeting. Connections written into the fabric of what they were, and that he'd claimed her in that arena not to own her but to protect her, to give her the space and safety to discover who she actually was beneath the poison and lies, and that whatever she chose after that, whether she wanted this bond or wanted to walk away once she was strong enough, he would honor it, would honor her, because fate might draw two souls together but love, real love, was always a choice. Anna had felt something shift inside her as he spoke, something fundamental realigning like bones settling back into place after a break, and beneath the exhaustion and the anger and the fear, she felt something else, a warmth spreading through her chest, silver and bright, like sunlight hitting snow, and for the first time in her 19 years Anna felt her wolf stir, not the desperate clawing of something trying to break free but the slow languid stretch of something waking after a very long sleep, and she gasped as warmth raced under her skin, visible for just a moment as silver veins of light that traced up her arms and made her eyes flash gold in the darkness, and Drogo had gone very still, his hand tightening on hers, his expression caught between awe and something that looked like vindication, and Anna had looked down at her hands glowing faintly with power that was finally hers, and understood with perfect clarity that she hadn't been broken or weak or incomplete. She'd been buried, suppressed, hidden even from herself, and now after years in the dark, she was beginning to wake. The High Council chamber was carved from the mountain itself, a vast circular room with a domed ceiling that seemed to capture and amplify every sound, stone benches rising in concentric rings around a central floor marked with the territorial sigils of every major pack in the north, and when Anna entered 3 weeks after the purging treatments had begun, she felt the weight of 100 eyes land on her with the force of physical blows, pack leaders and their seconds filling the seats. Representatives from territories she'd never heard of wearing formal regalia that spoke of old power and older grudges, and at the center of it all stood a raised platform where Drogo waited beside an empty chair meant for her, his expression carved from stone but his eyes, those silver eyes that had haunted her dreams, tracking her movement with concern barely hidden beneath his alpha mask. The council had been called to formally challenge the claim of fated recognition, a move that surprised no one given how many political arrangements Anna's protection had disrupted, trade agreements suspended, territorial negotiations stalled, marriage alliances thrown into question because if the Alpha King could invoke ancient law to claim an Omega from a minor border pack, what did that mean for the carefully constructed web of obligations and debts that held the northern territories together? And Anna had been briefed by Thala and Sarah about what to expect, told that she would be questioned, that her presence was required but her voice was not, that the safest course was to remain silent and let Drogo's authority carry the argument. But as Anna climbed the steps to the platform and took her seat beside the most powerful alpha in the north, she felt her wolf stir beneath her skin, still weak from years of suppression but growing stronger every day, whispering that silence was survival but speech was power, and she wasn't sure which one she'd choose when the moment came. The challenge was led by Alpha Varn of the Western Reaches, a thick-shouldered man with a beard like iron wire and eyes that assessed Anna the way you'd assess a horse at market, and he'd opened by questioning the validity of the claim itself, suggesting that ancient laws were called ancient for a reason, that they belonged to a time before formal pack structures and documented lineages, that invoking such laws in the modern age set dangerous precedents that could destabilize everything they'd built, and Anna had felt Drogo's hand tighten on the armrest of his chair, his control absolute but his anger a living thing that pressed against the air, and he'd responded in that voice that carried absolute authority that the laws were ancient because they were foundational, that they predated politics because they were written into the biology of what they were, and that any alpha who wished to argue against the fated recognition was welcome to present evidence that the bond didn't exist. But they'd find no such evidence, because Anna's sense sang to him in a way that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to instinct, and every wolf in this chamber could smell the truth of it if they were honest. Then Beta Cormac had stood, still furious about the disruption at Bloodstone, and presented the trade agreements, official documents signed by Kieran and Declan Gray, transferring custody of their sister in exchange for debt forgiveness and territorial access, all perfectly legal by border pack standards, and he'd argued that the High Pack's interference had violated established protocols, that Anna had been legitimate payment for legitimate debts, and that allowing this precedent meant no pack could conduct internal business without fear of royal intervention, and Anna had felt something cold and sharp twist in her stomach as Cormac held up the papers, as he reduced her entire existence to signatures and terms, as he made her brother's betrayal sound like reasonable financial planning, and her wolf had snarled beneath her skin, pushing against the remaining suppressants in her blood, demanding she make them see. Drogo had responded by gesturing to Thala, who'd risen with the calm authority of someone presenting scientific fact rather than political opinion, and she'd explained in clear clinical terms what her examination had revealed: years of systematic poisoning with suppressant herbs, compounds that didn't occur naturally and had to be carefully mixed and consistently administered, evidence of deliberate and sustained efforts to prevent Anna's wolf from emerging, and she'd presented blood samples and analysis reports and documented timelines that painted an undeniable picture, that Anna hadn't been sold because she was weak or unremarkable, She'd been sold because her brothers had spent over a decade making sure she appeared that way, and the chamber had gone quiet as the implications settled over them like snow, because suppressing an Omega's wolf wasn't just cruel, it was illegal under pack law. It was the kind of thing that spoke to either desperation or calculation, and neither reflected well on the men who'd done it. That's when Anna had heard the commotion at the chamber entrance, the guards trying to prevent entry and failing, and Kieran and Declan had strode in with the kind of righteous fury that only comes from people who've convinced themselves they're victims, both of them dressed in formal territorial garb that they'd never worn when Anna lived with them, both projecting the authority of pack representatives rather than the desperate debtors they actually were, and Kieran had demanded the floor, had claimed that Thala's evidence was circumstantial at best, that the herbs she mentioned were common remedies for Omega health issues, that they'd been trying to help their fragile sister survive in a harsh world, and that the real crime here was the Alpha King's manipulation, his use of political power to claim an Omega who'd already been legally transferred, his rewriting of Anna's history to justify breaking established agreements, and Anna had felt the chamber's attention shift, had felt the doubt creeping in because her brothers were convincing, they'd always been convincing, they'd spent years telling her she was broken while making it sound like compassion, and Declan had added that Anna had always been unstable, prone to episodes, that she'd been dangerous to herself and others, that suppressing her wolf had been a mercy not a crime, and he'd looked directly at her for the first time since entering the chamber and said with perfect false concern that he hoped the Alpha King knew what he was dealing with, that he hoped Drogo understood the risk he'd taken in claiming someone who'd never been fit for normal pack life. The rage that had been building in Anna since Thala's first examination, since she'd learned that every weakness she'd been taught to accept as fundamental truth was actually calculated poison, finally reached critical mass, her vision tunneled and then expanded, her hearing sharpened until she could distinguish individual heartbeats in the crowd, and beneath her skin something massive and silver and furious started to rise, and she'd gasped as the partial shift took her without warning, as her bones began to restructure and her muscles screamed and silver light traced up her arms like lightning through her veins, visible through her skin, glowing bright enough that people in the front rows recoiled, and her eyes, she could feel her eyes changing, the color bleeding from soft brown to molten gold, and the power that had been locked away for 19 years finally, violently, demanding to be seen. The chamber erupted, people standing, shouting, some moving toward the exits while others pressed forward to see better, and Anna had tried to control it, tried to pull the shift back because this wasn't how it was supposed to happen, not in public, not in front of hostile witnesses, but her wolf had been caged too long and now that the door was open it wouldn't be closed again, and the silver light intensified until it was painful to look at directly, until Anna's entire body was wrapped in luminescence that seemed to come from her bones themselves, and she'd heard Thala's voice sharp with shock saying words that didn't make sense at first, royal bloodline, silver wolf, ancient markers, and then Drogo was beside her, not touching but present, his voice low and steady saying she was safe, she was in control, she could let the wolf rise or pull it back, the choice was hers, always hers. Kieran had started talking again, louder now, playing to the crowd, saying this was exactly what he'd feared, that Anna had always been unstable, that this display of power proved she was dangerous, that he and Declan had been protecting the pack from something they didn't understand, and Anna had felt the narrative shifting, felt her brothers taking her awakening and rewriting it into evidence of her own deficiency, and she'd understood with brutal clarity that this was the moment she could stay silent and let others define her story, could let Drogo's authority shield her while her brothers painted her as a threat that needed to be contained, or she could speak, could risk everything she'd been taught about Omegas knowing their place and staying quiet, could choose truth over safety and voice over survival. The silver light pulsing beneath her skin steadied as Anna made her decision, she rose from her chair, the partial shift still rippling through her body making her taller, stronger, her eyes still blazing gold, and the chamber went silent because an Omega standing during council session was protocol violation enough, but an Omega standing while mid-shift with royal markers glowing in her blood was something none of them had ever seen, and Anna had looked at her brothers, really looked at them for the first time with eyes that could see more than human sight aloud, and she'd spoken in a voice that carried harmonics of both woman and wolf, steady and clear and absolutely certain, "You're right about one thing, I was dangerous. Dangerous enough that you spent 13 years poisoning me to make sure I'd never know what I was. Dangerous enough that you kept me weak and silent and convinced I was broken. Dangerous enough that when you finally decided to sell me, you chose the most brutal pack you could find, hoping I'd be destroyed before anyone discovered what you'd buried. She'd stepped forward, down from the platform, moving toward her brothers who'd both gone pale, and the crowd parted without conscious thought, responding to the power radiating from her even though she still didn't fully understand how to control it, and Anna had continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "The herbs weren't for my health. The weakness wasn't natural. Every time you told me I was fragile, every time you said I needed protection, you were really saying you were afraid of what I might become if my wolf ever woke, afraid of what questions I might ask about bloodlines that shouldn't exist in a minor border pack, afraid that your unremarkable sister might turn out to be anything but unremarkable." Declan had tried to interrupt, to reclaim control of the narrative, but Anna had felt her wolf surge and the silver light had flared brighter, and her voice had dropped to something that resonated with ancient authority. "You don't get to rewrite this story. Not anymore." The chamber held its breath as Anna stood before her brothers, the men who'd raised her and betrayed her, and she'd felt the wolf inside her gathering itself, felt it preparing for something momentous, and when she'd looked back at Drogo his expression had been fierce with pride and concern in equal measure, and she'd known that what came next would change everything, would mark her as either victim or survivor, as property or power, and there was no going back from this moment, no return to silence or safety, only forward into whatever truth she'd been buried to prevent. Anna closed her eyes, took a breath that tasted like snow and silver and starlight, and let her wolf rise fully for the first time, not in privacy or safety but here in the council chamber before hostile witnesses and political enemies, before her brothers and their lies, before the entire assembled hierarchy of Northern Pack leadership, and as the transformation took her, as bones restructured and muscles reformed and silver fur erupted across her skin, she felt power she'd never imagined coursing through her body, felt her consciousness expand to hold both woman and wolf without conflict or confusion, and when the shift completed and she stood on 4 legs in the center of the chamber, massive and silver-furred and radiating light like captured moonlight, every wolf present felt it in their blood, felt the unmistakable signature of royal lineage, the kind that hadn't been seen in the Northern Territories for 3 generations, and Kieran and Declan collapsed to their knees not from choice but from the sheer weight of dominance rolling off their sister, the Omega they'd tried to erase, the girl they'd sold like livestock, who was now standing before them as living proof that some things can be buried but never truly destroyed. Anna stood in her wolf form before the assembled council, silver fur catching the light from 100 torches and throwing it back amplified, radiant, impossible to ignore, and she didn't snarl or threaten or display the aggression that would have been expected from someone finally claiming power after years of suppression. Instead she simply existed in her truth, letting the evidence of what she was speak louder than any accusation could, and when she shifted back to human form the transformation was controlled, graceful, her body remembering what it had been denied for so long, and she stood naked in the ancient way, unashamed, because shame was something that had been taught to her by people who feared what she might become, and she was done carrying their fear as if it were her own. The chamber had fallen to its knees, not from command but from instinct, from the biological imperative that recognized royal blood when it manifested, from the undeniable weight of dominance that even alphas couldn't resist when faced with lineage that predated their territorial squabbles and political games, and Anna had looked at her brothers, still on their knees, faces drained of color, and instead of rage or vengeance in her voice there was something more devastating, clarity. She'd explained, not accused, speaking in measured tones that carried to every corner of the chamber, telling them exactly what they'd done and why it mattered, how they'd taken a child who trusted them and systematically erased her potential, how they'd chosen their own safety over her identity, how they'd convinced her that weakness was inherent when it was actually inflicted, and how in the end they'd sold her not because she was worthless but because even suppressed and buried she was still valuable enough to clear their debts, and the worst part, the part that made her voice finally crack just slightly, was that they'd never once asked her what she wanted, never once considered that she might have a say in her own story, never once treated her like a person whose choices mattered. Sarah had brought a robe wrapping it around Anna's shoulders with hands that trembled slightly, and Anna had turned to face the council fully, addressing not just her brothers but every alpha and beta who'd built their power on the silent suffering of those deemed lesser, and she'd said that judgment needed to be delivered not with blood but with truth, that cruelty answered with cruelty only perpetuated cycles that had gone on too long, and so her brothers would face exile, not death, not torture, but removal from pack lands and pack law, their names stripped from territorial records, their bonds severed so completely that no pack would be required to offer them shelter or protection, and they would spend the rest of their lives as rogues, belonging nowhere, with nothing but the knowledge that their own choices had unmade them. Kieran had tried to speak, to plead or protest, but Anna had held up one hand and the silver light had flickered in her veins just enough to remind him what she was, and her voice had been absolutely final when she'd said, "I deliver this sentence myself, by right of blood and by right of the harm you caused, and there is no appeal, no negotiation, no second chance, you are exiled effective immediately, and if you ever set foot in pack territory again, the mercy I'm showing today will not be repeated." The guards had moved forward, not roughly but firmly, escorting Kieran and Declan from the chamber, and Anna had watched them go, feeling not triumph but a strange empty relief, the kind that comes when you finally set down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body, and she'd realized that this moment, this choosing of justice over vengeance, this claiming of authority to spare rather than destroy, was more powerful than any violence could have been, because it proved she was nothing like the people who'd hurt her, that their cruelty hadn't infected her core, that she could hold power without letting it corrupt her into becoming what they'd feared. The council session had continued with formal acknowledgments of Anna's bloodline, with pack leaders pledging recognition and support in voices that ranged from genuine to politically calculated, but Anna had barely heard them because Drogo had been watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between awe and concern and a question he hadn't yet figured out how to ask, and when the session finally ended and they'd returned to his private quarters, he'd done something that shattered every expectation Anna had built about what it meant to be claimed by an alpha. He'd knelt before her again, not as political theater but in privacy, just the two of them, and he'd said that the fated recognition gave him the right to claim her but not the right to keep her, that ancient law protected her from others but not from him if she chose to leave, and that he was offering her absolute freedom, the choice to accept the mate bond or to walk away with his protection and resources. But without obligation, because fate might have drawn them together but love, real love, had to be chosen freely or it wasn't love at all. Anna had looked down at this man who commanded armies and ruled territories, who'd invaded her dreams for months before they met, who'd rewritten her entire existence with 6 words of ancient law, and she'd felt her wolf stretch contentedly inside her chest, not pushing or demanding but simply present, finally whole, and she'd realized that the bond between them had never been about ownership or obligation. It had been about recognition, about two people seeing each other clearly and choosing to move toward that recognition rather than away from it, and when she'd taken his hands and pulled him to his feet, when she'd said, "I choose this, I choose you, on my terms and by my own will," the mate bond had settled into place not with force but with the quiet certainty of something that had always been inevitable, just waiting for them both to be ready. The reforms had started immediately, Anna working alongside Drogo and a council of Omegas she'd assembled herself, dismantling the trade systems that had allowed her sail, enacting protections that made suppression illegal across all territories with penalties severe enough to actually deter, creating sanctuaries where Omegas could learn their own strength without fear, and establishing educational programs that taught young wolves that designation didn't determine destiny, that Omega wasn't a synonym for weak any more than alpha was a synonym for wise, and Anna had thrown herself into this work with the fierce dedication of someone who'd survived hell and was determined that no one else would have to walk that same path. The coronation had come 6 months after the council reckoning, and Anna had stood beside Drogo not in the flowing gowns and delicate jewelry that traditional Luna ceremonies demanded but in fitted armor that allowed movement, that declared her equal rather than ornamental, that announced she would rule beside him not behind him, and when the crown was placed on her head, silver like her wolf, beautiful but sharp-edged, functional as much as symbolic, she'd felt the weight of it and welcomed it. Because this weight she'd chosen, this responsibility she'd claimed, and that made all the difference. Years later, Anna would stand in one of the sanctuaries she'd built, watching young Omegas train and learn and discover their own power, and a girl, maybe 15, with downturned eyes and a nervous voice that reminded Anna painfully of herself, would ask if it was true that Anna had once been sold by her own family, if she'd really been that powerless, and Anna would kneel down to meet the girl's eyes and say, "I was that powerless, yes, but power isn't something you're born with or without, it's something you claim when you finally understand that other people's fear of you doesn't define your worth, that their attempts to diminish you say everything about them and nothing about you, and that the strongest thing you can ever do is choose yourself even when everyone else has chosen to give up on you." And the girl would nod slowly, something shifting in her expression, something hard and determined replacing the uncertainty, and Anna would watch her walk away with her shoulders a little straighter and think about how much had changed, how the girl who'd been counted in gold and delivered in chains had become the woman who rebuilt the laws, who stood equal beside a king, who proved that destiny might open doors but it was choice, always choice, that determined whether you walked through them. Anna would return to the fortress that evening, to the quarters she shared with Drogo, and he'd pull her close and she'd let herself rest against him, two people who'd found each other in dreams before they met in waking, who'd chosen each other despite fate, or maybe because of it, and she'd think about her brothers sometimes, wonder if they understood yet what they'd lost, what they'd tried to destroy, but mostly she'd think about the young Omegas who would never have to be told they were payment, who would grow up knowing their worth wasn't determined by others' needs or fears, and she'd remember what she told them every time she visited, the words that had become her creed and her gift: "No one gets to decide your worth for you, not your family, not your pack, not your designation or your past, that choice belongs to you alone, and the moment you truly claim it is the moment you become free."